Hi there! If you're just here to hear me talk about my thoughts on the game, skip to this timestamp. Thanks! Two years ago, I made a video about an old MMO called Phantasy Star Online. It was a game I played during my formative video game years, and a game that I still retain special memories of. As of this writing, that video is one of the most popular ones on my channel, and this is something I'm quite happy about. After all, I put some raw emotions into the making of that video because the subject matter was so important to me. So it's nice that that video is the one that's gotten so much attention. Regardless, anyone who watched that video will recall the sad tale near the end of how a sequel/spiritual successor was announced about a decade ago, but was never localized for a Western release. As the years passed with no news, those of us that were looking forward to playing a localized PSO2 had pretty much given up all hope. Anyone that didn't speak Japanese but still wanted to play the game just used an unofficial fan translation tool that let them do that. Though they did have to learn basic kanji so that they could get by the infamous and brutal CAPTCHA boss. But then an announcement came out of nowhere. And I mean out of freaking nowhere. At E3 2019, Microsoft announced that they would be bringing over an English Phantasy Star Online 2 to the Xbox One and PC in spring of 2020. I can't tell you what sort of waves of nostalgia hit me at that point. But if you'd like a better assessment, you can check out my Twitter reactions during the announcement. And hey, guess what? Microsoft and Sega kept their promise this time. Phantasy Star Online 2 has officially been released in the West after 8 years of waiting. So long, CAPTCHA boss! Your services are no longer required. It should come as no surprise to anyone at this point that this is something I've been anticipating for a long time. And I'm sure that there are also those that have been anticipating a video from me on this for a while. So, here you go. This is Phantasy Star Online 2. So, if the conspicuous 2 didn't tip you off, Phantasy Star Online 2 is meant to be something of a spiritual successor to the original game back on the Dreamcast. The game isn't meant to be treated as a direct sequel to the story, but instead capitalized on various elements that would put nostalgic tears into one's eye. There's classic sound effects, weapons, classes, and the general vibe of the game is meant to reflect the original formula, but updated for a modern market. And I actually think PSO2 manages to pull off the updated nostalgia gameplay pretty well. The game implements various elements of other Phantasy Star games from the last few years, like the photon art system from Universe, but it still manages to capture the gameplay identity of the original Dreamcast game. The hack and slash loot hunting days of PSO are back in this game. You load into an area, fight your way through dozens of enemies with flashy attack animations, pick up loot, and eventually make your way to a cool boss fight. Then, you go back to the ship and do it again. Combat has a rhythm to it, requiring you not to just spam attacks, but time your strikes if you want to optimize damage due to the perfect attack mechanic. Something reminiscent of the quick normal attacks and slower heavy attacks in the original game. Weapons also have their own unique attack speeds, animations, and parameters just like the original, and they're limited by what class you pick. You can pick whatever class you want based on how you want to play, and there's no restrictions to what your party makeup is. For that matter, if you don't like the class you made, you don't have to make a completely new character. You can just go to the counter and swap it up. It's nice. Furthermore, the class system itself is expanded from having 3 base classes that focus on melee, range, and magic to a whole slew of classes that still cover these areas, but also mix and match to varying degrees. Right now, my preferred class to play is Braver, the katana and bow wielding class. Bravers are all about doing tons of raw physical damage with quick attacks while being careful not to get hit in return lest they get ripped apart like a user Metacritic review on whatever popular game came out while writing this. It makes me feel at home the most considering that my original class in the original PSO was an android hunter or HuCast that focused on physical damage and didn't have access to magic. And that's another funny thing about PSO2 when compared to PSO1. While there are unique races to play as, none of them seem to have standout attributes like the original game had. During character creation, you're told some vague information like how casts are more durable or Newmans might have better magic, but ultimately I'm finding it to not really matter. You can play as whatever you want with whatever class you want to fit your fancy. You want to be a robot? Be a cast. Want to be a human? Well, you can. Want to be a Newman? Well, you're an elf now. Want to be a horned elf creature because you're actually a homestuck and you make tieflings in D&D all the time? Well, you can do that. Also, I'm not judging, but I see you. And personally, I don't really mind this change. While I did like how the various races felt more unique in the original game due to their unique attributes, like how casts straight up could not use techniques, I prefer freedom of choice customization over racial pigeonholing in games like these. I think it's a good choice to let players play with their virtual paper doll however they want, especially in a game like this where a huge appeal is the ability to create a completely original character. It might be something that min-max players don't agree with, but there are plenty other options that will satisfy that particular game enjoyment. Trust me. Naturally, I went with a cast character again, and of course I named him Death Scythe, being able to fit his entire name in this time. I also gave him some sweet aviator shades that he wears on his head but not over his eyes, because he's such a cool guy, and he's about to go on a really cool quest. Death Scythe and the other heroes like him are all part of an intergalactic exploring/peacekeeping force known as Oracle, and Death Scythe himself is a member of the paramilitary group known as ARCs. The duty of the ARCs is to travel to various exotic locales, meet interesting and bizarre alien creatures, and then kill them. The main threat the ARCs face is a dangerous race of dark beings known as the Fallspawn, which have been cropping up everywhere and causing a ton of problems for them. Slowly but surely, the ARCs work together to unravel the mystery of the Fallspawn and put up a valiant effort of defending their way of life from them. I know that most people are going to focus on things like the general MMO-ness of PSO2 and the character classes and how these things are the biggest difference between this game and the original, but for some reason, the thing that gave me the most whiplash was the heavier focus on new characters and the story that was present. MMO stories have come a long way in recent years. A lot of modern games like Final Fantasy XIV have done a really good job of weaving interesting narratives and likable characters that turn the appeal of the game into something more than just goofing off with friends or grinding for new loot. There are MMOs now that people play specifically for the story, which is something that is wild to me. I mean, seriously, back then it was like, hey, go out and kill 30 pigs and bring me their feet for the local apothecary. I don't know what he's going to do with those things, but he's given me a pretty sweet belt for it, so here you go. I feel like PSO2 was going for that story-driven experience to some extent, given how many chances there are to interact with NPCs and learning more about what makes them tick. There's specific client orders that sort of let you bond with these characters, and they'll give you gifts in return for doing them. And then there's the story quests, if you really want to call them that, where they mostly just amount to having you watch a brief cutscene with a character as they talk to you about what's going on in their current character arc before you're shoved back into the lobby. And then of course there is the overarching plot with the Fallspawn and trying to unravel that particular mystery as you are supported by your fellow ARCs. It's pretty standard JRPG stuff. And I think the reason I find this particular element so jarring when compared to the original game is because the original PSO barely had a story, and its character writing was mostly non-existent. Phantasy Star Online 1 was, at its core, a cosmic horror story. You were a mercenary hired to investigate a tragedy that had occurred, and were given little to no backup or information to go on. All you knew was that Pioneer 1's people were missing, and you needed to find out why. Sure, there were context clues leading you through the game, and it built up to a grand finale. But it was also something that was very easily missable. Your only support came from your own abilities and maybe your companions that came down with you. The Hunters Guild missions tried to delve a little bit more into the world of PSO, but even that was bare bones. The minimalistic approach to the story was something I really enjoyed, though at least for what PSO was trying to be. I got a lot more enjoyment coming up with my own backstory or trying to theorize exactly what happened to Pioneer 1 in the first place. Having such a blank canvas to work with let my mind run wild. PSO2 is different because while your character is still a blank protagonist, you've got a much stronger support network to draw on. There's a heavier focus on your NPC allies, not only in how they're presented in the story, but also how you can just go and talk to them, do requests for them, and overall are clearly supposed to get more invested in what is happening with them. On the one hand, this means that PSO2 has a more focused narrative than the original game. But on the other hand, it means that your character also just sort of becomes a vessel for telling other characters' stories opposed to crafting your own. And I should clarify, I don't think that this is bad. Having a narrative with developed characters is good. But I think what made the original PSO unique to me was how much of the narrative was built upon my own experience and imagination because of how little there was. At the very least, if you don't care about stories, characters, or other narrative elements in your MMO grindfest, you don't have to subject yourself to that in PSO2. Much like its predecessor in that regard, the story is there if you want it in its own cordoned-off series of quests, but if you want to just rise and grind all the way to max level, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. There's a lot to do in PSO2, which I think might be part of my issue with it. I keep reiterating this point, but the original Phantasy Star Online was a pretty simple game. There were 3 classes, 3 races, and the basic concept of attacking enemies until they died, getting loot, and saving the day was all you really needed to bring it all together. Sure, you could delve a little deeper into some of the fine attribute mechanics, like how certain weapons might have a higher hit percentage than others, or what techniques did more damage against specific enemies, but I've always felt the math game that's present in a lot of MMOs was subdued in PSO. And it might just be my HuCast preference showing, but most of the time it was just a case of picking which weapon was cooler and did more damage. PSO2 does not play that game. PSO2 plays a very different game. A game that involves attributes, crafting, enhancing equipment, managing what seems to be like a tiny inventory, stat boosting items, skill trees, sub-skill trees, and much, much more. There is so much shit thrown at you with PSO2 right from the beginning, and while the game does try to walk you through it piece by piece with some optional client orders and rewards to incentivize doing those tutorials, it's very easy to get lost very quickly. You've probably seen several what you should do starting out videos for PSO2 pop up on YouTube, depending on your watch history, and I feel like that should have been your first hint that the PSO2 system runs a lot deeper than the old hack and slash days of 2 is a higher number than 1. PSO2 is the type of game that thrives on MMO chase, the idea that you're supposed to be constantly working towards your next level or cool new sword or whatever other goals you've set for yourself. The chase and grind are what create longevity for an MMO, that and having people join you on that chase. Whether it be for story progression, character growth, or building a cool wardrobe, there are plenty of carrots on sticks to chase in PSO2 that inspire players to keep playing as long as possible. And yet, it's kind of exactly for those reasons that I don't find myself wanting to play PSO2 that much. The cold, hard truth that I've come to accept while playing PSO2 is that I don't think I have enough passion to keep playing this game and progress within it like I would in other MMOs I've played in my lifetime. Truthfully, it's not because I even think that the carrot on the stick concept when it comes to MMOs is bad or that I'm criticizing it specifically. It's just that while PSO2 has all the things that would make you want to play a modern MMO, I just don't feel that it does it quite as well as other games on the modern market to keep my attention. The story of PSO2 has such a sporadic presentation that the narrative hasn't been engaging enough to keep me invested in what's going on. There were a few moments that I thought were neat, like when we had to go to a civilian city and fight back the false spawn, but moments like that are spread too thin for me to get too excited for them. The combat is fun and there's a ton of variety in what sort of weapons and classes you want to use while laying waste to your enemies, but after a few runs, it all sort of starts to blend together, and that MMO repetition of doing the same thing over and over in order to grind towards your goals starts to settle in. That sort of thing could be mitigated more with a good group of people to play with, but so far I haven't really found the community of PSO2 in-game yet. It's entirely possible that it's just the way I'm playing it, but anytime I try to find groups of people to play with in-game in PSO2, I'm not getting a lot of success. Sometimes people will join my group and then either just blaze through the map ahead of me and leave halfway through without saying a word. It doesn't really feel like I'm playing with other players in PSO2 half the time. Instead, just being a couple of anime protagonist ships passing in the night. There's a few events that do bring people together in-game, and I found those to be rather enjoyable. There's urgent quests that fill an area with multiple parties that are fighting an army of falspawn, or virtual concerts where you can go to the place in the lobby in-game and listen to a Newman J-pop singer. That one was a lot of fun, actually. It gave off a real Macross vibe. And then, of course, there's teaming up with people to take down the big bad of the franchise, Dark Falls. But after these events end, the game goes right back to its own odd isolation grinds, and I'm just not sure how to feel about that. And if you watched my original PSO video, you might recall I mentioned that in the original game, I didn't even like playing online as much as playing by myself or with my older brother in co-op. So you're probably thinking this is a weird sentiment to be making, that the game feels too isolated at points. And I can understand that sounds contradictory or hypocritical. But I think what it really boils down to is that PSO2 is just a vastly different beast at its core than PSO1. PSO1 was very bare bones, and a lot of enjoyment came from what I personally made out of it. PSO2 is a game that's designed to give you a million different things to do at any given time, and strangely enough, it's resulted in me not wanting to chase any of it. So in the end, do I think PSO2 is a good game? Yeah, I do. I think it's fun, has a lot of potential, and I think there's going to be a lot of people that find a great deal of enjoyment from it. But for me, I think I'm just going to stick to other MMOs for now and maybe go back to playing the original because I feel like those suit me better. I am glad that I finally got to play it in my native language, though. It's kind of a miracle that the game was brought over in the first place after I had long given up hope of that happening. So, at the very least, I was able to finally sit down and play it and form this opinion based on first-hand experience. But while I'm thankful that Microsoft took a risk in localizing the game after so long, I do have to say that the launch of the North American client has been pretty awful and unforgivable. The Microsoft Store has somehow broken my launcher no less than 3 times and required me to re-download the game each time. MMO launches are a hit or miss in general, but I feel like when you're localizing a game that's been out for almost a decade now, your excuses are minimal. Supposedly, they're going to be bringing the game to other PC platforms as well, so maybe that means it'll end up on Steam like it probably should have been to begin with. And I should say that the roadmap that they've laid out is pretty impressive. The game launched with the first 3 major content updates, or episodes as they're called, already in the game, and right now they're planning to go up to episode 6 by the end of the year. That's a lot of content to get right out of the gate, so people who are enjoying the game are going to have a lot to do for quite a while. I liked Phantasy Star Online too, but I don't love it, and I think if I do keep playing it, then it'll be very sporadic. At the very least, the game is free to play, so I don't have to worry about the sunk cost of having to keep up a subscription. Though, even from what I've played, I can already see that freemium free-to-play model that a lot of mobile games and other free MMOs tend to do. So we'll see how many restrictions there really are. If you want to check it out, you can get it on the Xbox One or the Microsoft Store for PC. But if you're gonna go for the PC version, I highly recommend looking up a quick guide of how to safely download it from the Microsoft Store. Because I can't emphasize this enough, the Microsoft Store sucks.